And those aren't people who are writing posts for the darkest corners of the conspiratorial internet. Those are sitting United States congressmen. That was the former ambassador to the UN, perhaps a presidential candidate in Nikki Haley. And I would add to Congressman Collins that I can think of only one person who's attacked the Gold Star family, and that was President Trump during the 2016 campaign. But Donnie Deutsch, the big picture here from Nancy Pelosi and Democrats, and also actually from a small, but a handful of Republicans who voted for the War Powers Resolution is you have to come to Congress. We're basically underlining a principle that already exists in the Constitution, which is that a president needs to talk to Congress before making a decision to take the United States to war. And now that has been spun by some of people on the right and these sitting United States congressmen as hating America, as supporting terrorists, as mourning the loss of a terrible person in General Soleimani.
You know, it's amazing, those radical leftists who basically are just defending the Constitution. You know, that makes them very, very radical. You know, Joe, it's interesting. You talk about people, if they're buying any of this, that they're morons, that they're stupid. Something to maybe make our viewers feel a little bit better, because coming from the advertising world, used to say, you know what, a voter or a consumer is not a consumer. They're your next door neighbor. They're your mother, they're your teacher. They're not morons. And what's interesting, a new USA Today poll that says, are we more safe or less safe? 55% say we are we are less safe, and only 21% say that we are more safe. So I think people do in their
more
core,
safe. What you mean after the killing?
After the killing, yes. And I do think that people do have a primal sense, and I think when you start to insult voters or insult your next door neighbor or insult your mother, people have a sense of it. And I think that is the core thing that this administration has left behind, that people are not morons. People are not idiots in mass. And that USA poll proves it. You know, it's very simple. I'm not a strategist. I'm not a war guy. I'm not a politician. But I can look and say, since that happened, Iran, once again, you know, amping up their nuclear warheads 5 months away. We are taking our eyes off of fighting ISIS. You've galvanized the Iranian people. Oh, and by the way, we're probably going to be leaving Iraq, which makes us less safe. So it's not that complicated to look and see. Oh, and by the way, there are 63 Canadian families mourning this morning, collateral damage as a result of Trump's act. So the escalation has killed already.
Well, Donald Trump didn't fire those missiles, so you put that on the Iranians, completely on the Iranians. I do think it's fascinating. You look at those numbers that by an almost 20-point margin, Jim Vandehei, Americans thought Donald Trump's actions were reckless. This suggests, actually, that Donald Trump's initial instinct in 2016 was a correct one. Americans are exhausted by wars in the Middle East. Now, listen, I'm still not sure how I feel about the killing of Soleimani personally. Still not sure about it. I think Congress should have been advised. I think it's something, though, I say that just for argument's sake, to put it out there to say we need to have a debate about it. It needs to be a reasonable and rational debate. I can be influenced one way or the other, but these clowns that are going out and saying that somebody who disagrees with them on a war powers argument somehow loves terrorists, that's pretty disgusting. Right. And I don't know. I think back when you and I were roaming around on the Hill a couple of decades ago, I don't think that was happening.
No, and go back. I was thinking about that time period as you were talking. Over the last 20 years, Congress is basically making itself irrelevant. It's almost snapping itself as a branch of government, leaving the presidency being even more and more of an imperial presidency and increasing the importance of the courts. If Congress says, you know what, the hell with it, don't consult us at wartime, which we've now been doing for 20 plus years. If you say we're kind of irrelevant even in a lot of the domestic policies because we allow things to be done by executive fiat, if you basically can ignore us when we're subpoenaing you, like suddenly these people, these members of Congress are basically making sure that the position that they won is exponentially weaker. And that's what I think gets lost.
And Jim, just to be irritating to both sides, I'll follow up on what I said yesterday. Yeah. This isn't just Donald Trump. Like, this was George W. Bush after
Yes,
9/11
for sure.
seizing power from the Article 1 branch. It was Barack Obama doing the same thing with all of his executive orders. Again, consolidating power in the Article 2 branch, and Donald Trump doing the same thing, of course, much faster pace, doing some things that are just outright unconstitutional on their face, like, you know, declaring emergencies and stealing money from the defense budget to build a wall.
And it might seem to some viewers like we're going down a rabbit hole of just sort of debating something that would be in a political science classroom, but it's not. Like, if you worry about authoritarianism, if you worry about one person having too much power, we have essentially created an oligarchy, right? The president has so much more power today than he's had in the past. And then if Congress basically says, the hell with it, we're not that involved, then the only other arbiter, the only other break on the power of the presidency is the court. And conservatives have been pretty smart about putting a lot of effort into making sure that they can tip the court at the federal level and at the state level towards conservatives, because that's durable, and they're the referees about whether or not you go too far. So these things do have a consequence. This is no different than the debate around the Iraq War and the Patriot Act and how we thought about the response to 9/11. At every point, Congress just says, yeah, do whatever you want to do, basically.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.